I'm still Martin Ince. I'm. Yeah, I should use this. Is it actually? Is it working? Okay. For those of you who are here this morning, I'm still Martin Ince, but you'll be relieved to hear that my remarks this afternoon are a bit briefer than they were earlier on. Unlike some of the later speakers, such as Charlie, I'm not going to use anything like PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk, really. I thought I'd go retro for 1976 and produce an overhead projector and some slides, but decided against it. This morning I talked a bit about undercurrents in general as a project in a way that I'm not going to do twice. Instead, I'm going to talk about the food section of the original book, edited by Barbara Kerr and me. I last was in touch with Barbara 38 years ago, I think, by the way. I lost touch with her. And about its resonance in the modern world. And then our distinguished panel will have their say, and then we'll have some discussion. And I'll introduce the panel as they come on. But just to say, at the far end there is Paul Allen. And Paul, you have a large lever, which if anyone goes over time, you sort of pull it and we're plunged down into a pit full of sharks or something. Okay, as you said this morning, I'm a self-employed communicator. I'm working in the field of science and higher education, and was for many years a member of the Undercurrents Collective. It's important to realise, again to repeat on what I said this morning, the remit given to Barbara and me was not to predict the future. I've worked with futures types a lot, they would never attempt to predict anything 40 years out. In any case, and again as I said this morning, we're there to build a better world, not to forecast one. Digging out my copy of Radical Technology, I found out, again to repeat what I said this morning, the basic structure of it's held up very well, reflecting basic human needs. Turn to the food section. I'll divide into three zones, and I term the political, the practical, and the mystical. And that perhaps reflects the book's ethos more widely. I still defend the slightly pompous introduction, which seems to have Barbara's and my name on it. It's just a few points. Firstly, that producing food outside the market mechanism can be more nutritious eating. Secondly, that it is economically viable. But thirdly, very important, that it can also prefigure bigger challenges that people can make to the economic and social system. And I believe the values that set of statements really involve are ones that remain valid. Okay, the section begins with and a number dense analysis by you, Charlie, and I'll talk about it in a more detail in a minute, of the evils of agribusiness. In fact, we're already showing your first slide. But anyway, you prove all ends up that agribusiness is unproductive, uses all sorts of fell substances like oil and fertiliser, ravages the environment, enslaves farmers, etc., etc. I'm sure that that's true then. I'm sure it's probably, if anything, even more true now. This piece is followed by two examples of what I'd call the practical genre. The first is an aggressive defence of meat farming by John Seymour, that self-sufficiency fame. But then a substantial figure, by the way, in the UK media stage. He sort of proves that farming without animals is doomed and is impossible. That across the United States, Europe, etc., vast expanses of plant growing are basically being sustained in a way that can't go on. He then has to go at vegans, who he regards as a particularly evil kind of crowd, who says they're always nipping off to proper farmers to beg manure from them to keep their pathetic farms going. This is in an era when vegetarianism was a rather cranky sort of choice, unlike now. It was indeed a vegetarian restaurant called Cranks in that era. His piece is notable for the very nitty-gritty detail it contains on how you go about farming animals and eating them. It'd be fascinating to know if anyone actually did it on the basis of the book. Later on, he also delivers a valuable chapter on fridge-free food preservation, again full of all sorts of interesting stuff. The same very detailed approach is taken by Lawrence Hills of the Soil Association in his contributions to do with compost. He recommends nicotine as the ideal insect repellent. Boil up your own cigarette ends, or if by any chance you don't smoke, get them from the local cinema. Also, intensely practical are the chapters on fish farming and hydroponics. Massive detail on how you set up and run these systems. I realised on rereading it that hydroponics might not be as green as you think, and it seems to involve an awful lot of grinding up bones. Also valuable is my friend John Shaw's piece about the food value and nutritional value of food, which remains, I think, very valid and useful stuff to this day. So by modern standards, the book's very didactic. It's full of useful, valuable information. It's not afraid to pile on practical stuff, throwing tables and diagrams. It was written in an era, people, when the term dumbing down wasn't really a thing, and I think that's all to the good. Perhaps more in the sort of mystical territory is the chapter on organic farming, on Steinerian principles of anthroposophy, if that's how you say it. The word didn't underline that term when I typed it. The chapter is really a call for farming methods which take account of the nature of the plant you're trying to grow. 40 years on, it seems almost mainstream. I think the same can't be said for the chapter on Zen macrobiotics. Introduced to the West, it says in the book, by a little Japanese fellow called George Oshawa. So we insulted 120 million people of Japan, but also he wasn't even called Oshawa, he's Japanese, he's called Osawa. Anyway, this hasn't aged so well, this piece, and if we do a second edition of the book, we should certainly correct the spelling of his name. I don't think it's generally accepted, as the author of this piece said, that potatoes are in fact poisonous. The last couple of pieces in the section look forward to current concerns. One is about water farming, also, again with all sorts of helpful advice along with a touch of divining. The other is on the need to assess the value of forests, reassess the value of forests, not only as places to produce food, but also as ecological assets in their own right, for example, for water and for land conservation and preventing erosion. So I think we did a fair job. The Undercurrents Collective at that time was a rather urban setup, frankly. We weren't very well informed about food, except at the most romantic of levels. We had ideas about what you ought to eat, but we knew far less about the tricky question of actually how you go about growing it. You, Charlie, would probably be the exception to that. The other one was farm boy Chris Squire, then with added Hutton. Chris was tapped about our efforts, but he certainly took me to one side at one point and told me that he thought, for example, the idea of self-sufficiency was completely stupid, and that if John Seymour could only grow enough food to feed himself and his own family, he was certainly in the wrong business. Okay, as I keep saying, we were never asked to predict the world of 2016. A lot of things we failed to see coming that we now regard as important, and of these, of course, the biggest and best in the field of food is climate change. Now, Barbara and I, at the time we did this section, were both working as geologists in the oil industry, amazingly enough. Despite that, we had no awareness of climate change, despite the fact that the original scientific paper, as you may know, on this subject was published in 1896. It was 80 years old at the time. In the same way, we never grasped the really transformative phenomenon of the IT revolution that was coming, that we discussed this morning. Because after all, it's transformed agriculture just like it's transformed everything else. It's not just computers that have transformed food. Precision agriculture to reduce inputs of water, for example, other essentials of food production. Graphic information systems, which kind of allow farming to be a bit cleverer and allow smaller farmers to be more genuinely competitive with big ones. At the same time, we'd probably regarded GPS, which is absolutely vital for current agriculture, as some evil plot by the military rather than a useful asset that we should make the most of. For me, one of the most striking points, and it's allied to what I've just been saying with this whole section, is the sheer amount of work that is involved in all the things that we're suggesting. It's envisaged people doing pre-industrial amounts of sweated labour to feed themselves, and it's imagined that they would choose this as a lifestyle option they wanted to go for, in the teeth of thousands of years of evidence that people don't like doing hard work. If we did it now, I think we'd have more of a machine in the garden approach to be renewable, high technology, green robotics, if you like, rather than all that digging, which I think people now just wouldn't buy. In addition, the section is highly oriented towards the production of food. It doesn't say an awful lot about food as something that you might sell to other people or that you might eat, or examine alternative approaches. No mention of fair trade, no mention of animal rights, no recipes, and we'd have more healthy diets. Okay, so as I've said, just very briefly, how long is that, by the way?
You've had 10 minutes.
Okay, just to say very briefly also, the book was really the product of a time when people worried about scarcity, when mass starvation was seen as a prospect for the human race, partly because of the word of Paul Ehrlich, and at a time when half the world's population lived in poverty as defined by the World Bank. Now it's only about 10%, still too many, of course. So in almost every country in the world, except those that have had serious political collapse, including in the developing world, in Africa, obesity is more a problem, overweight is more a problem than underweight in the northern world, and that again would reflect how we do this book if we did it again. Also, of course, we failed to take account of the vastly growing, I think, influence of market forces on traditional societies and of the growing power of the food producers and sellers. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now, but I may come back in a moment to one or two of the things that we did right or wrong. I think, in addition, it's true to say that food is such a basic human need. the facts about it change rather more slowly than the facts about communication or the facts about shelter. Maybe that's one of the reasons I think why this section has held its value in a way that parts of the book have much better than others. Thanks very much. Okay. The next speaker, Charlie Clutterbuck, has been an activist, a political activist involved in the trade union movement, especially to do with food, but also to do with health and safety for many years, and as a general sort of political troublemaker in a very good way. Was an active member of the Undercurrents Collective for a long time. If you want.
Right, yes, I quite have to be a trade union troublemaker, but I just wanted to click back 40 years. I'll be doing the 40 years in between. But I actually was trained to be a soil zoologist, and I've given that up for 40 odd years, but I've realised there's only about 3 soil zoologists in the country, and so I feel it's my responsibility to bring the soil to life through soil animals, and the little bit of time I've got left before I join the soil animals, I feel I could contribute my knowledge. And part of that is I'm using some basic technologies to try and get the soil animals out. That photo was taken at the Todmorden Aqua Garden, where they're giving me a room called Dr. Clutterbuck's Soil Lab.
Excuse me, could you take just away from your mouth, because you're actually interfering with your communication.
Okay, is that a bit better? Is that better? Right. So this is at Todmorden Aqua Garden, where I'm building this here. And I'm putting it out to everybody else who likes to develop new technologies, especially this one, because I'm dealing with the roots, and as Pete Harper says, the word radical means root, and of any radical technology, this must be it. So if anybody would like to help me, I want to develop this stuff so that it can go into schools in a very standard sort of way. Right, now I just click on. Right, so 40 years ago, remember, the IMF had just walked in to sort out the Labour Party, and the paper I wrote then was all about these subjects: efficiency, pollution, ecosystem, labour power and markets. Today, I put new Tory government, but I think the word we now use to describe the political milieu is Brexit, and I'll finish up on that. And it was quite interesting. Somebody was just contributing in the last discussion about the efficiency, using land efficiently, I think about animals. And it's quite interesting. I started this article on efficiency, and I still think it's very relevant today to talk about efficiency and what we mean by it. Also, we talked about pollution, about labour, power and the market. So I'm going to rattle through this quite quickly. Don't worry, the whole PowerPoint has got all the links to lots more details if you wanted to follow on. And so, efficiency, I wrote a book with somebody called Tim Lang called More Than We Can Chew ages ago, in which we had a chapter called F for efficiency, because, as we implied, it isn't very good. Most efficiency is about productionism. In other words, how much do you produce per acre? It's locked into that. However, the markets for food are such that when you keep producing more food, the price that you get back reduces. So there's more of an drive to be more efficient in terms of productivism, i.e. The efficiency of the labour process in making that commodity. And we tend to leave that behind. And so when you look at it in terms of actual product per acre, again, I think it was David Lee was sort of talking about the use, the production in gardens and small areas. There was a paper after the war called Garden Controversy, which showed that urban areas with gardens could outproduce traditional farming for the same acreage, even including the houses. So I said then it was all about profit, and it still is. And the trouble is, we're still dominated by this free market notion that we keep producing into the market. And that's not gone away, that's going to get worse. And again, I've got a whole website called Mad Food Matters. You know, basically, the trouble is, if I could say one thing, is that all these people that keep saying we need to produce more food because there's starving people in the world, we've been saying it for 50 years, we now produce twice as much food in the world as we need to feed those people. The whole European system, the whole American system is subsidised because we can overproduce all the time. So spending £50 billion on subsidies in America, we'd like to get our hands on 50 in Europe, I'd like to get our hands on that. And perhaps that might be one good thing about Brexit, that we might be able to get our hands on the £3 billion, mainly given all to landowners at the moment. If we could get hold of that and do something, it would be great. So I came from an avowedly left-wing stance then. I was into trying to mix the greens and the reds together, and I had problems because the left didn't see food as a political issue. It was a middle-class thing, that was it. Now that I'd have to say it's changed a lot, food is seen as political now, unlike then. But even today, a lot of the analysis ignores the role of capital. That the whole process of profit accumulation is to build capital, and still the capital in agriculture is off the land. It's in the chemical companies, it's in the machinery companies, it's seed companies. It's not on the land. Whereas a lot of the things we're talking about, actually, we need to build capital on the land in a very benign way. Yet service capital still needs cheap food, just as the rest of finance capital did and industrial capital did. It's still a driver, is that to produce cheap food. At the same time, I set up a thing called the Agri-Capital Group to look at that. Just how did capital grow up around agriculture? And I was working for the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science. I need my microphone to say that properly. And as John Goodman said, there's an archive being set up. BSSRS are meeting up with Wellcome to set up an archive of all these materials. If you've got any materials, let John or myself know, and because it will basically be a radical science archive. It's not just BSSRS. We're collecting on behalf of the Wellcome. Now, direct pollution. By the way, a copy of the article is in the notes at the bottom. You don't see it now, but if you take a copy of this, you can see the original article. At that time, direct pollution was the problem. As Martin was saying, it was pesticides. We were just coming out from Rachel Carson. The drins were particularly nasty. I spent years on the Health and Safety Executive on behalf of the farm workers. I've been on the advisory committee on pesticides to try and control these pesticides as best as possible. And I think, to have to say, we've done a pretty good job. It took a lot of work, but we have brought them under control. On fertilisers, still far too much fertiliser used, especially, and while it's reduced on pasture, there's still going up on arable land. Nitrates are now part of what Martin was saying. You call it climate change, I still call it global warming because it's basically heating up the earth. The nitrate problem is now seen not as a direct problem to rivers, but as part of the global warming scenario. And if you like, there's been a paradigm change in terms of pollution, from seeing it as a matter of toxins to now a matter of benign substances, which all of a sudden, are doing damage. The obvious ones, carbon monoxide was toxic. We talk about carbon dioxide now. In the old days, it was additives which were the problem in food. Now it's sugar, not fat, by that, sugar. In other words, it's natural substances which are overusing rather than toxic substances. So our thinking has had to change. Ecosystems. What I want to do is quickly divide the farming in this country. We tend to lump it all together. There's two very distinct forms. On the west side of the country, where we are here, it's predominantly pasture, mainly family farms, permanent labour on the whole. So pasture, dairy, sheep, whatever. On the east side of the country, completely different monocultures, migrant workers. Let's call them what they are, plantations. It's plantation agriculture going on in the east, whereas it's family farms on this. We need to make that divide much more. So that what we couldn't see then was the monocultures which have developed in the east of the country. We had no sense it was going to get as noticeable as it was. But we've talked about biological controls as a good thing. And biological controls, using other little nasty insects to kill, nice insects to kill nasty ones. We've actually come in glasshouses, and curiously enough, the biggest users of them are places like Thanet Earth, which produce virtually all the peppers and tomatoes we eat in this country, all with the British label on. But it's a bit ironic, because I have to say this without actually putting it on slides. My union, Unite, used the whole power of Unite, not just the tiny little farm workers sector where I was on the committee, used a whole new night to try and organise Thanet Earth. They spent months recruiting people. They got 150 recruited up to it. Went to the management and said, we've recruited 150, and by the way, the worst thing they all complain about is holiday entitlement. So the management said, oh, you can have your holiday entitlement now. Go on then. Of course, they all went off on holiday, and guess what, when they came back? No jobs. So we've tried to recruit there, and no whatsoever. But the article was Radical Technology in 1976. We were following the 1970 food price hikes, which Nixon in particular in the States was very worried about. And that led to butts and corn and the overproduction of corn, which I can't go into. We're following something. I've had 10. Can you give me about 2? Since 2007, there's been the latest price hikes, and that led to, in part, not totally, to the Arab uprisings, because a lot of the Arab countries switched from growing their own to exporting the stuff coming in. Middle class prices were hiked up, and changed. But that was the stimulus. In terms of corporate control, we couldn't have imagined then how much more so it's got. In particular, the chemical companies buying up the seed companies. Monsanto's buying up every seed company. You can think of Syngenta as well. By the way, Syngenta, the biggest agricultural chemical in the world. Did you know the Chinese state bought it, lock, stock and barrel, 43 billion pounds was of it about 2 months ago? Not in the news. And Syngenta was the old ICI. The ICI patents on paraquat and all that were part of it. So the Chinese owned what was ICI. So I'll just try and finish off the future. The free market madness, I think, is going to go on and gets worse. I just said that the biggest problem is not underproduction, it's overproduction. We can easily produce too much food. Capitalism goes out of its way to try and control the overproduction, but in the process of doing so, likes to hold cheap prices so it can feed the rest of capital. I think post-Brexit, it's likely that we're going to do more individual trade deals, that European countries are going to be more subsidised and invade into Britain. At the moment, the figures I've been using up to the last week or two were we import 40% of our own food. The stats I've got about a week ago from the University of Stirling is it's 50-50 now. We're importing 50% of our own food. I reckon that's going to get even worse because with the cheap food coming in, free marketeers are going to want more and more cheap food. How they're going to run the plantations, I can't begin to see, how they're going to replace those migrant workers, although I do declare the British Strawberry Federation, that well-known bunch of Marxists, have approached David Davis to try and get special visas for the migrants on the farms. And think, doesn't that defeat the whole object of Brexit? So, what I'd like to say is, I think our analysis was pretty good 40 years ago. There were certain things we couldn't have foreseen, but if things were bad then, and the thing I've missed out, and the thing I wanted to say at the beginning really, was the whole public sector, what I learned and taught in, all those colleges I was educating have gone. 3/4 of the research stations have gone. That's why with so much, the aggro between the corporates and the rest of science is so distinct. There's no middle ground. There's no public sector doing the research anymore. It's virtually completely gone. And that, I think, is going to be our worst aspect of moving forward. We just quite simply don't have the science to do it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? Our next speaker actually, a slight help point, Charlie, has a farm. Romy Fraser is the founder and owner of, if I got this right, a Trill Farm in East Devon, and the founder of Using Remedies, and you're really most welcome. So.
Welcome. I'm not quite in the position to give you all the great information that Charlie has. Really fantastic. There's so much that Charlie's just said that I actually agree with and would like to have said myself. But maybe if I just give you a bit of background. I met Herbie when he was working in the Roundhouse, because I was working in the Roundhouse too. So I come from sort of late 60s, trying to create a vision for the world and how we could just make a difference. And as a trained teacher, I got a job in a progressive school in South London. And it was there that I decided that what really needed to happen was a form of education that connected kids and adults, as it happens, kids with nature and the natural environment. And I still firmly believe that without that sense of knowledge and connection, the way forward is going to be a bit not the way we want it to be. So I got a chance to take over a retail site. I set up Neil's Yard Remedies with the express idea of setting up this education project, which I felt should give young people the opportunity to learn how to grow food, produce food or process it, learn how to prepare it, share it, and work together in doing this. So 8 years ago I bought Trill Farm, which is 300 acres in East Devon. And like Charlie said, it is a mixed farm. I've turned it into an organic farm. And at the moment, it hosts 6 farming-based businesses. And one thing I must say, that one of the businesses, for example, the vegetable growing business, is based on 2 3/4 acres of land with a turnover of 50,000, a bit more than that actually. So it is possible to make money. Yes, we do look to supplying restaurants and people can afford to produce, to buy, to pay for quality food. But actually, there's a huge amount of sharing going on as well. Particularly obvious at the moment, where we're sharing the harvests, we're sharing the meat that's the animals that have made the mistake of crossing the land at the wrong time. We share, there's 6 or 7 different working units, people that live on the farm but work on the farm. And I'm not saying it's perfect, because human beings aren't perfect, but one of the things that struck me was, in reading through radical technology, a lot of it is correct about food. There's not much to argue about, but what struck me was the importance of making it more wide known, the importance of the quality of food, the importance of health. And I don't think that comes out. And I think education really has to be the key behind food and food policy, because the Tesco's and worse are just going to be more and more available for the people that have less and less money. And that's really what concerns me now. So I think it's not so much the food that people buy, it's the understanding of what we should be eating and what we can do. And I think that's what we should be doing and looking towards doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you are next, Martin. Sorry. Just to introduce you briefly, Martin Stott has worked for a long while in UK local government in the environmental field, including being Environment Director of Warwickshire, before now becoming Chair of Garden Organic, formerly the HDRA, which, as you say, Martin, is the UK's national charity to promote organic horticulture. So we'll be delighted to hear from you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I discovered I was talking today at 11 o'clock this morning, so I don't have a PowerPoint or anything like that. Actually, before I start talking about Garden Organic and the old Henry Doubleday Research Association, which was incidentally not the Soil Association was referred to, that was a completely different outfit. I just want to pick up on the William Morris theme, because I think that was really interesting. And I just want to, just a few reflections myself, because I think William Morris was a very important figure and remains a very important figure. I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I'm actually chair of the William Morris Society, which is a worldwide organisation. I just thought that this kind of Arcadian perspective of William Morris that was talked about in the 70s was kind of a reflection of the way that people lay onto Morris what they want to see, and that undoubtedly that theme within News from Nowhere was important then, and it still is to some extent. But the zeitgeist is different now, and Morris, as in terms of his politics and in terms of the nature of work and the relationships to technology and all of those things, are actually things that the Morris Society and others, and there are quite a few other people involved in that, are focusing on more these days. The ceramicist Edmund Duval is doing a big talk in central London for the Society in a couple of weeks' time called Crafting Democracy, which will bring together all of those things around the nature of work, the nature of craft and the nature of democracy. And I just thought I'd mention that. I mean, there's a couple of books that have come out recently which reflect this, I think. William Morris in the 21st Century, written by Rosie Miles and Pippa Bennett, and the collection of items called Anarchist Seeds Beneath the Snow, from William Morris to Colin Ward. And I just thought it was just worth dropping that in, because there are lots of people who are obviously interested in Morris, and I'm one of them. Let's move on to Henry Doubleday Research Association. You'll find in here, as Martin Ince said, there's a piece by Lawrence Hills, who of course was the founder of the Henry Doubleday Research Association. The name of the organisation was changed some years ago because people kind of didn't understand what that meant. Even its activist members had a rather hazy idea that it had something to do with comfrey, but that was about as far as it went. I'm just going to read the first two sentences in what Lawrence said, which was, anything written on organic gardening must begin with making a compost heap. This is the essential recycler that makes it possible to garden without chemical fertilisers. So, as Martin was saying, actually it was a very practical article. So practical, in fact, that he talks about why you should soak your bricks in water before building your brick compost heap so as to make the cement stick better. I won't go into details, but time has moved on a bit, because he also suggests using asbestos sheeting and creosote. So I'm not sure these things that Garden Organic would recommend these days. I just want to mention that. Now, talking of Garden Organic, it's 30,000 members. It's one of the it is the national charity for organic growing and horticulture. And as Charlie Clutterbuck said, actually growing in allotments, back gardens, small holdings, on your balconies, etc., is a highly productive form of growing. Any members of Garden Organic here today, as a matter of interest? Oh, good, quite a few. Nice to see you. Let's have a conversation afterwards. I just want to sort of, in a sense, bring you up to date on what Garden Organic is up to, because Lawrence was very practical. There's lots of practical advice about growing potatoes and cabbages, about self-sufficiency, comfrey, of course, and composting. And this was all vital for people who didn't know all that much about gardening. But the Garden Organic these days, which really does aim at that group below the full-scale farmer that the Soil Association is associated with. And we compete in a nice way some of the time, and we're complementary to each other most of the rest of the time. I think that's probably a fair comment. We're based at Ryton, which is just outside Coventry. Near neighbour John Goodman has just been talking a bit earlier. Not at Bocking, which is where it was when Radical Technology was written. Bocking's in Essex, and Lawrence Hills moved it to Ryton in 1990. I never knew Lawrence Hills. No, it was a bit earlier than 1990. He died in 1990. What does it do? Several people have asked me. Obviously, it supplies its members with information on organic growing, including providing the practicals through the Heritage Seed Library. It has a demonstration garden at Ryton. It has a growing network of organic gardens across the country where people can go and see things happening, not just at Ryton. And it supports members' experiments. Again, something that Charlie was picking up on, the whole concept of citizen science. I think it's fair to say that HDRA and its successor in Garden Organic have been quite significant in the citizen science movement, and still are. And actually, the Ryton site, which is in some ways too big for us these days as an organisation, we've recently teamed up with the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at the University of Coventry, and they've moved lock, stock and barrel to join us at Ryton. And I think that's been a really productive relationship, because some of the things that Radical Technology talks about, the term agroecology actually hasn't been used today before, but I think that a lot of what we've been talking about in that widest sense is what we would call agroecology. And the references to global climate change, I think, are picked up by the Coventry University department in the rest of their title, i.e. Water and Resilience. So I think that relationship with Garden Organic is an important one. In terms of how we get that message across, apart from through our members, through gardens and through research, is through campaigning. We've been heavily involved with campaigns against the relicensing of glyphosate and of neonicotinoids, and of course we've had some success in both of those fields. At the practical level, we work a lot with schools. There's a huge growing food in schools programme, quite a bit focused in London for reasons of funding, and indeed that grew out of the work that we did for the Olympics in 2012, where there was a coalition of groups, which included Garden Organic, which promoted urban agriculture, essentially. The 2012 growing areas in Greater London were part of the kind of wider Olympics legacy, and Garden Organic was very central to making that happen. And we're very much involved in the whole world of therapeutic growing, for instance, particularly in prisons. We would do a lot of work in prisons, and working with the new-ish clinical commissioning groups in local government to promote healthy living and growing, and actually also stuff to do with waste management. Composting is a form of waste. Waste reduction is another issue that people have referred to this afternoon, and there's a programme for people, actually activists like yourselves, a master composting programme, a master gardener programme, and even a much smaller programme for promoting the keeping of hens, called Hens at Home. I'm not going to say any more than that now, except to say it's been a pleasure coming here today, and I'm glad I was able to cobble something together in the breaks between the sessions. And don't forget that actually Lawrence Hills' legacy is still very much alive and very relevant to all the things that people like ourselves are doing in Radical Technology 2.0. Thank you.
That's brilliant. That's extremely well received, especially at such big notice, and we're very grateful. Finally, Erik, are you going to start?
Yes, I will.
Our final speaker this morning, if you think this book's old, haven't seen anything yet. I'm not referring to the speaker, I'm referring to his organisation, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. whose 50th anniversary conference is coming up any minute now, I think, Erik Millstone.
It's on Wednesday.
And you told me a moment ago that you've been interested in food since 1974, and you've worked in this field, as I say, as a distinguished professor in the field of science policy, and you're the final speaker.
Thanks very much indeed. I'd like to try and do without the microphone, if I may. I want to start from the text in Radical Technology Volume 1 that we're coming to discuss, and because I read the section on food 40 years ago and I was very impressed by it, but I'd like to characterise it now as having a relatively narrow agenda. It focused on autonomy, an issue that's already been discussed, but also on a limited range of aspects of the ecological sustainability of producing food. These are important and legitimate issues, but that's not the whole story of the problems with the food system. And about the same time as Radical Technology came out, so too did another book in 76 that I found enormously influential, which is Susan George's book, How the Other Half Dies, which is about hunger in the third world and about and explaining that hunger is not a consequence of inadequate food supply. There's more than enough food in the world, and Susan George talked about the way in which artificial scarcities are created by corporate capitalism, but why people are hungry because of chronic poverty. And so perhaps we can generously interpret the discussion on food in Radical Technology as trying to diminish the demand that the readers of the book and the adherents of the movement would be making on the food supply and the harm that their consumption habits would be inflicting on the planet. But the food agenda is actually much wider. And despite the fact that he was government chief scientist, I quite like John Beddington's characterisation of food security that he came up with a few years ago, where he characterised it in terms of sufficiency, sustainability, safety and equity. And not all of those issues were explored in Radical Technology. In particular, there's precious little on food safety, which I interpret in terms of microbiological safety, nutritional issues and toxicological issues. And they exploded in the 80s. I still like to say, rather cynically perhaps, that it was remarkable that Edwina Currie lost her job for what I take to have been the only true statement of her ministerial career. Namely that most egg production facilities were contaminated with salmonella, but there were also food safety scares in respect of additives, pesticide, other microbiological issues, food irradiation, and of course the really big one, BSE, mad cows in English. This erupted into an enormous seismic rupture in the UK, and I think to some extent the UK in European food politics. I used to say the BSE crisis was the biggest failure in UK public policy since the Suez crisis. I now say it's the worst failure between the Suez crisis and the invasion of Iraq. But it brought about change, and it did push food policy up the orthodox, conventional public policy agenda. Now, back in the early mid-70s, I was working to a similar extent on food and shelter, and at the time there seemed to be much more work on shelter and housing policy. It seemed to be a much more urgent issue, and if you'd asked me then to predict which was going to have greater impact and salience in public policy, I'd have said housing, not food, and I'd have been wrong. I mean, housing policy hasn't had the salience it should have had, we can all agree on that, but it's extraordinary the way in which food policy did erupt. onto the public policy agenda in the late 80s, and then particularly in March 96, when UK government ministers had to stand up in the House of Commons and said, you know, we told you BSE was totally safe. Well, maybe it wasn't. Oh, but British beef is really now. And it wasn't just confidence in beef, but in food safety and the whole supposedly science-based expert advisory system for technological risk. Confidence in that evaporated and provoked a whole range of reforms. In the UK, the incoming Labour government, led by Blair, set up the Food Standards Agency. Similarly, subsequently, when BSE erupted in Germany and several continental countries, the European Food Safety Authority was set up. They were supposed to end food safety scares. They have, of course, done nothing of the sort. They were supposed to separate regulation from sponsorship, which they haven't done. They were supposed to separate science from politics, which they haven't done. And food safety scares are going to come rumbling on. But I maintain that the issues concerning not just agriculture, but the food system as a whole, including inputs, agriculture production, food processing, retail, catering, as well as consumption. Taken as a whole, the food system today is significantly less sustainable than it was 40 years ago. Levels of pollution in aggregate are higher, food safety standards are declining, nutritionally, microbiologically and toxicologically. Maybe there's a bit less pesticide being used in the UK, thanks quite possibly to your efforts, Charlie, but as you recognise, the UK imports 60% of its food, and the pesticide use that gets into the UK food supply is correspondingly greater. The environmental impact of the food system that sustains the UK is greater than it has ever been, and the problems have not been solved. So the issue has moved on, but it's moved on in strange ways. As I said, it did rise up the food supply and up the political policy agenda. Now, while Blair set up the Food Standards Agency, he thought that had finished it. He thought there was nothing left. Well, Blair, God help us, thought that there was nothing wrong with the food system that Tesco couldn't sort out. Gordon Brown, for all his many faults, actually had a much more sophisticated take on food issues. Partly provoked by the food price volatility around 2008, he thought there were very serious problems in food security, and he set up a Cabinet Office inquiry which published a very interesting document called Food Matters, which is a volume of two halves, the first half of which documented in majestic detail the innumerable ways in which our food system was fucked. The second half imagined a future world in which all the contradictions have been resolved and everything's going to be hunky-dory, but there was nothing connecting section 1 with section 2. How'd you get there from here? So actually, in response to that, he then set up something called the fourth group at the Government Office of Science, led something called foresight study of the future of food and the global future of food and farming. So it wasn't just UK, it was also global. So it was all not just thinking of feeding the UK, but what is the impact of UK's consumption and production habits on the rest of the world. So it was quite a sophisticated take. Unfortunately, Gordon Brown lost the general election before it was published. It was published by the incoming coalition government in January 2011, and as far as I can tell, had been forgotten by UK government ministers by February of 2011. Has never been mentioned since. So issues that were central to Radical Technology 1, at least some of them, did come very close to the top of the UK public policy agenda in the last part of Gordon Brown's administration. It's since dropped, but my prediction is it's coming back. And I pick up on what John said. Brexit, a screw up on heroic proportions, means that the UK is going to have to set its own food and agricultural policy, which, with the exception of BSE, it hasn't done for 43 years. There is nobody in the Food Standards Agency or the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs who's got a clue about setting food and agricultural policy. Anyone who ever knew about that has either been forced out or has retired since. The staff in those institutions are a small fraction of what they used to be. They're running around like heads with their chickens cut off. I mean, it is a complete brown trouser job in Whitehall. And as you can imagine, the large corporate organisations, the Food and Drink Federation, Coke, Pepsi, Cadbury, Schweppes, the NFU are running to the minister saying, you have to put our interests first. And there are going to be really hot debates in the near future about which direction food and farming policies are going to take in the UK. And while we lived to exciting times, say from 86 to 96, it's going to get hot again in the near future.
We have a couple of minutes for questions. The hand up there at the back already.
Just a comment. That was fantastic, all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, just I suppose I was just thinking about, while the average age of farmers continues to rise, actually what we're seeing is the average age of brewers falling quite steadily, the average age of bakers falling quite steadily, and a whole explosion, 200 new breweries opening a year. I'm involved with one that opened myself. My son is training to become a craft brewer. There's huge interest and excitement in that whole thing. There's a place in the US, in Santa Rosa, there's a brewery there called the Russian River Brewing Company. They brew one beer that's only available 2 weeks every year called Pliny the Younger. And during those 2 weeks, 16,000 people go to Santa Rosa to drink that beer. And the local development agency reported that actually it brought $5.3 million into the local economy during that time. So what really interests me is actually this sort of reimagining of food and this sort of retaking back of food has huge potential as a local economic development tool. We did some research in Transition Network where we looked at a market town, Totnes, an urban neighbourhood, Brixton, and the county of Herefordshire, and looked at how much money they spend on food every year. In Totnes we spend £30 million. Of that, 22 million goes out through just 2 supermarkets. In Brixton, 93% of what they spent went out through supermarkets. It means we can start to say, actually, if we could manage a 10% shift where I live, that's £2 million in our economy every year. That's a form of economic development that we can start shaping tomorrow. We don't need anyone's permission, we don't need any policy change. We can work with a whole range of different local organisations. I was really inspired the other day to read about Preston City Council, who brought together the universities, the police, the hospitals, to look at how much money they spend every year. As organisations, they spend £750 million every year. They were horrified to find that only 4% of that money is actually spent into the economy of Preston. The rest of it just pours out. They're now going through a whole process about how do we become more embedded in place. How do we bring our pensions back to help us become more embedded in place? It comes back to the discussion before about building materials can drive the same kind of process. So for me, it feels like the roots of those ideas sat in radical technology. We see them kind of coming now. The explosion in sales of craft beer is such now that actually it's one of the things that is used to measure inflation. As this is my last one of these, I hope this has been useful. It's been one of the oddest things I've done, leaping up and attempting to say something vaguely relevant and intelligent, but it's been a real honour, and I really want to salute the people who produced this, and as one of the representatives here of the generation that came after that, I really want to thank you for the shoulders that we have attempted to stand on ever since. Thank you.
Can we run on for 5 minutes? Yeah, we can run for 5 minutes. Questions there? There's one at the back, went straight up in the middle there. Yeah.
I'm a small-scale farmer, and I suppose there's been a sort of sub-current of the conference I felt uncomfortable with, where this morning I was sort of told that, living in the countryside, it's the wrong place for me to be. I ought to be urban, and in this session there's this sort of current that nobody really wants to farm. Farming is back-breaking work. People want to get out of farming. I think what people really, it's not back-breaking work. It's relatively easy to farm. The problem is people don't want to be screwed by a food system or by landowners. So again, we get back to the kind of social dimension, rather than this sort of rather blanket view about where we should live or what we should be doing.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Romy would like to come back to you on that one.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in my experience, one of the most exciting things that's happening at Trill Farm is the constant flow of really amazing young people who are engaged in farming. And if they're not engaged in farming, they really want to learn how to produce their own food. Lots and lots of highly intelligent, great young people.
Yeah. Oh, there was an enthusiastic hand there, straight up.
So it's Lucy Kay again, and just 2 points. There's been lots of talk about food, but very little about other products from agriculture. And we've talked about carbon sequestration into the building trade. What can we do there? What can we do about raw materials for industrial manufacturing? So there's a whole range of agriculture that I think we need to be exploring to displace fossil fuels, and we need to explore it.
Oh, this gentleman's been very patient all day. Last question.
If you've been patient all day, please proceed.
David Gordon. Thank you very much for the great talks. As far as I understand, the agricultural system in the UK at the moment has a lot of agribusiness farms, many thousands of what are called hobby farms, which are owned by fairly wealthy people that have a few animals and a horse for the kids, and some middle-sized farms with a lot of tenant farmers who have very little economic future under the current system. And one of the things that scared me when I was a young man and read that Science for the People was the article about the erosion of soil and how in 100 years' time there would be large areas of sterile land. What do you think we should do, policy would you advocate for the future, to get around these agribusiness problems that we currently have and all the policy, food safety problems that brings, and also the erosion of the land and productivity eventually to plant? Right. I'll have a go this one. The loss of soil from the land, 2 million tonnes, is being lost all on the eastern side of the country because of arable. It's the arable land which is doing the damage. Let's nail that one.
Sorry, that's been per year?
Per year,
yeah.
Per year, either in water or in air. Right? So the pasture land is looking after the soil. If you look in the soil under the pasture land, there's probably twice as many soil animals as under the arable, and maize is worse. Right? So there was something called the Soil Directive, which the Europe brought in. We were supposed to enact and say, this is going to be our national soil plan, this is how we're going to look after the soil, we're going to invest in this research, we're going to do this, that and the other. I'm sorry, but the Labour government, Hillary Benn, decided we won't bother with that. So we never even got the Soil Directive, and they smashed it up in Europe as well, here and so we didn't. Europe hasn't got a Soil Directive. It's got about 10 biodiversity, sustainable directives, but none on soil. We need a national soil plan and a reward system for keeping the carbon in the soil. And we have to reward farmers for keeping the carbon in the soil. I don't know how, but that's what we have to do.